I'd like to welcome everybody to now session number 61 in the book of Acts. So we've been 61 weeks into this book. It's been a long study. We're coming to the conclusion. Last week, as you recall, we did the first half of chapter 27, which is the first half of Paul's voyage to Rome. That's where we run this week. We pick up the second half where we actually move into the shipwreck itself. Very, very interesting chapter 27 is studied by more non-biblical people than any other chapter in the Bible. Just as a tidbit there, it's known for his historical documentation around the navigation during this period, the types of ships, what they did, and all kind of historians really have studied chapter 27 and really have authenticated everything that was there from the places they studied to. I'm going to get into something today. You'll find it tonight. We find it pretty amazing. So chapter 27 really is historical. It's Paul's voyage from Caesarea to Rome, and they started off in a small coastal ship that wasn't meant to be put out to the Mediterranean Sea. The thing that we know about the Mediterranean Sea is it's in the wintertime, you don't really try to go across the Mediterranean from Egypt to Rome. Egypt was the main supplier of Rome's grain in those days. And so there were ships going back and forth from Alexandria, Egypt to Rome constantly, because that's where Rome got the majority of their wheat and grain from, believe it or not. So last week they were on a small ship that hugged the coastline, and they ran into really a town called, I think, Myra. And in Myra, they picked up what they called was an Alexandrian ship that came from Alexandria, Egypt. And if you see it down at the bottom of your screen, you see Egypt, you see Alexander, and it's going all the way across the Mediterranean. It doesn't look like much, but this is treacherous water. From about August 14th to around November 14th, that range, give or take some weeks there, is known as a dangerous time to sail these waters because of what was referred to as a northeaster. We heard of northeasterns on the eastern coast, but they're in the Mediterranean too. Very violent, almost hurricane force. Some of them are hurricane force winds. And so they started to pick up between August and November, but from November to March, no one sailed across the Mediterranean. That's how dangerous it was. So they started off most likely in August. Their trip was slowed down because of bad winds and things that they didn't make the progress they wanted. And you see they went to Myra at Lycia, and from there they caught the Alexandrian ship from Cnidus, and then from Cnidus to Fair Havens. And that's where we kind of picking it up tonight, is their only Alexandria ship. Remember, they wanted to stay in Fair Havens. Paul was saying we need to stay there, but it was not a place to port for the winter because it was a shallow port. It wasn't really good to port a big ship there. And the town was a little bitty town. There's no way they could feed all the people or entertain all the people that were on this ship. So most of the people, including Julius, and Julius was a centurion cohort, he was in charge of Paul and all the soldiers. He, along with the captain and the pilot, they're called by different names, all agreed that, look, we don't want to stay here. We want to get to another town further down off of Crete that is more favorable to harbor for the winter, because they have ran out of time. They recognize they're probably not going to get to Rome. They got to find some place to winter in. So as we pick up the story here in verse number 27, they left Fairhaven and they're trying to make it to Phoenix, which is only 40 miles. Only 40 miles, only a one-day trip. Remember Gilligan's Island, huh? Only a 3-hour trip. So it's only 40 miles. They're trying to get to Phoenix. And now we're picking it up at that point where the nor'easter actually hits them. So I'm going to turn it over to Annette and let her cover verse number 27.
Chapter 27, verses 27 through 29. Now, when the 14th night had come, that's 2 weeks they've been going through this, As we were driven up and down in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the sailors sensed that they were drawing near some land, and they took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms. And when they had gone a little further, they took soundings again and found it to be 15 fathoms. Then, fearing lest we should run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. So how do you think that the sailors sensed that they were coming close to land? Any ideas of,
Waves change.
Okay, that's exactly what happens. Most people surmise that they probably could hear a difference in what the waves sound like. So certainly out in the middle of the ocean, you're not having really breaking waves, but as it's approaching land, you begin to hear that breaking. And so that's probably what occurred. And my other question is, I could think of sonar and things like that, but what do you think it means to take soundings back at this time?
You drop a rope over the side with a weight, and you count the knots coming up, or whatever it was in cubics or whatever.
It's fathoms. So that's exactly right. So they took a weight and put it on a rope, and every fathom, which is approximately 6 feet, give or take a few inches, they would drop the thing down and count the knots or the marks, whatever it is. Knots is more likely because they wouldn't wear off, so they could count it. So the first time they realized they're about 120 feet off of land, and then the next time they took it, they find out that it was 15. So that's 60, 80 feet. 80 feet. So they're getting much closer. And that's exactly how they did it. Just see how long it takes. I think now that's replaced with actual sonar or some other way that they can detect the bottom. But it's funny they called it soundings back then. Actually, the Greek word for this process is called hearing the land, and they hear the land by reaching the land.
Yeah, and the one thing we mentioned last time, she had a picture of the boat to start with here. These were huge boats. They were about 140 feet long. They're only about 35 feet wide. But what we're told is they had a very deep draft. Remember, this is a sailboat. You remember sailboats have keels to kind of keep them balanced in the water. So this was more of a narrow boat, long boat, and it most likely had a very deep draft. What that means is it couldn't go in very shallow water. That's why around Fairhavens, it wasn't a good place to port because the wind could actually knock them into shallow grounds. So we don't know what the exact draft of this ship was, but as they struck 15 fathoms, they were getting worried they were going to run ashore. So it had to be pretty deep draft on this ship. But the next question here, which I found is interesting, is why would they place the anchors off the stern, the back of the boat? Whenever you want to weather the storm, you always anchor the bow into the waves so that the bow's taking the waves. The back of the boat is the stern, and therefore waves would come over the back of the boat. So why in the world would they anchor from the stern, the back of the boat, which you don't normally do when you're anchoring to survive a storm?
I'm going to take a wild guess at this.
Okay.
But that we're talking about a sailboat, not like a fishing boat or a crew boat or a supply boat. And the sails are not made to take a wind from the bow. I'm guessing either that or it might have been too late. The ground's coming up pretty good now, so they want to stop. So they throw them off the back because that's the way they were headed.
And
one
that's
of those,
go ahead, Charles.
one of those might be right.
Well, the issue here is it is somewhat of a sail, but it is a cargo. In the back of the boat, there is no rudder as you think of a sailboat. There are actually 2 big oars, each on one side. These oars have been raised and tied off. We know that. We also know the sails have been dropped. The masses were lowered because the wind was so violent, the boat was being swept along by the wind. So it wasn't being brought by really the sails themselves anymore. But I think what you said is got to be partially true, if not totally true. But what we learned from the commentators is that because they heard the shore coming up. They figure that they're drifting into the shore with the wind behind them. And so they're anchoring the stern so that the bow is facing the right direction. So when they do raise the sails, they have a front mast and a mid mast. When they rise those two mast sails, the wind is going to push right where the bow is going, because the bow is pointing right in the direction to where the wind is taking them. So that's why they really anchored to the back, is so they could get the bow. They intended for this boat to run aground, to run up on the beach. And in order to do that, they needed the most speed they could get. They couldn't be anchored in the wrong position because they had no way to really navigate, turn the boat around like in the boats you have today. They can't sail into the wind at all. That's why when they got caught in these high winds, they dropped the mast, they picked up the oars, and they were just at drift. They were at the mercy of a drift. Now, the current for the Mediterranean, really this time of the year, flows from the east to the west. It flows from Asia Minor, basically Israel and Judea, where Caesarea is. It flows along the coastline all the way up to the Adriatic Sea, all the way up into Rome. So they had the benefit of the current, but the winds were contrary. So they were moving along. An interesting fact here, though, is this was a commentary by Smith that basically some experienced Mediterranean navigators tested this with a drift boat. In other words, this is in today's time. They went out with a boat kind of something similar to this and drifted it along with the current and the winds with no sail. And oddly enough, they figured out that they could make about 36 miles in 24 hours. So that's how much they could do. Interesting enough, if you look at that number and you look at 36 miles in 14 days, they're within 3 miles of where their ship ran aground. So this stuff is so accurate the way Luke has depicted it. That's why I said this chapter is studied so much for the historical perspective, because everything is right on exactly as Luke has written it. And when it says 14 days and they're drifting at 36 miles a day, all that adds up. The other thing about the 14 days, we know that they were in violent weather along the whole way. So the last thing here is about the anchors being dropped off. There are some artifacts that have been found that they believe to be these 4 anchors. We weren't able to substantiate that in any of the commentaries. One commentary said that they believe they found them, but didn't go into detail and give us any information to do any research on. Not a big deal, but I found that that's more evidence to the fact that everything that Paul experienced that Luke wrote came true. And by the way, this place is named today St. Paul's Bay. That's the harbor they went into. So all this is historical, very, very fascinating.
So let's look at verses 30 through 32. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship, when they had let down the skiff into the sea, under pretense of putting out anchors from the prow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved." And then the soldiers cut away the ropes off the skiff and let it fall off. So why do you think that these men have to remain on the ship in order for everyone to be saved? We know from last week that Paul reported that an angel of the Lord, who he believed in and who he believed, told him that no one would be lost. So why is it that all of these men have to stay on board for this to be true?
Because they were the only ones experienced with handling the ship. I mean,
That's right. That's right,
Mommy
Charlie.
didn't do nothing.
That's exactly right. That's funny. You're getting all this spot on, but that is exactly right. They're the only ones that know about the mast and know about those oars on the back and how to engage those and steer. They're the only ones that have the expertise on running a ship. And some people guessed or surmised that perhaps because Paul was told by the angel that every single life was going to be granted to him, that he felt that they all had to remain together as one group for that to come to pass in that way. So I don't think there's anything magical about that. I mean, God said nobody will perish. Certainly keeping the boat intact was something that they should have been interested in. And that as a way, a means to get there, but we know that they ended up getting there in a different way. So they didn't use the ship, but it's just that these guys, I really kind of believe if these guys kind of snuck off and got away into the dinghy or the skiff, whatever it is, that they might have been outside the protection, but then of course God can handle it all, no matter where they are. But I think just keeping them together was impactful enough.
Okay, verses 33 through 34. And as the day was about to dawn, Paul employed them all to take food, saying, "Today is the 14th day you have waited and continued without food and eaten nothing. Therefore, I urge you to take nourishment, for this is for your survival, since not a hair will fall from the head of any of you." And when he had said these things, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of all of them. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. And then they were all encouraged and also took food themselves. And in all, there were 276 persons on the ship. So when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and threw out the wheat into the sea. So very interesting here, this first question is, and we've got opposing views of this, so there's not a right or wrong, but Paul presenting this food and breaking it and giving thanks to God and telling them to partake in the food, what actions does that mirror? Okay, a lot of people want to take the Lord's Supper, or like communion. They say this looks like communion. And so he takes the bread, he breaks it, he gives thanks, he gives it to everybody, and he tells them to eat. I can see that. There are also quite a bit of argument here that people try to spiritualize everything that's in the Bible. And sometimes you don't need to spiritualize it because it wasn't meant to be spiritualized. And so most commentators felt like this was a practical, physical need that these people had. They need to eat. They've been 14 days without food. They were weak. And now they had to get in the water, probably very cold, or get on a board, and they needed to make it to the beach. So Paul encouraged them that they needed to eat for their own physical well-being. So you have two different views here. I lean towards the fact that they needed to eat for their own physical well-being. That was Paul's purpose here. He wasn't sharing communion with them and sharing the Lord's table with them and giving thanks to Jesus Christ. While he was thanking God, no question about it, God also had a purpose that man should do. And man's purpose is to eat and get enough energy to get themselves to shore alive. So that was our responsibility as a human being. And so that's how really most of the commentators looked at it, even though some really wanted to spiritualize this beyond what you could really spiritualize it on.
So the next question, this was very interesting. What does it mean that not a hair of their head will perish? And I'm not going to ask you to tell me what that means, because I'll just say, when you do kind of this word study, this phrase study in the Bible, you'll find that this is really quite prevalent saying in the Bible. So this is a Jewish kind of, you know how we have our sayings. I didn't even try to think of one that it's similar to, but it's really prevalent throughout the Bible to mean like, don't worry, nothing will happen, or you're going to be just fine. It's going to work out okay. It's kind of the gist of it. We see Jesus using this, not a hair of your head shall perish. He uses that in Luke, chapter 21. He reiterates this phrase, and you can find it all through the Old Testament, about meaning that, look, if you do it this way, not a hair of your head will perish. If you don't listen, if you don't keep your covenant, then you'll die. You know, so it's just a phrase. Again, I just thought it was interesting, to kind of, it's just an odd phrase to go back and see that the true meaning is very common in the Jewish culture to say, well, not a hair of their head will fall or will perish, meaning you're going to be just fine.
Yeah, and I thought of something that would not make sense to these people. If you were in there at the boat and you said, boy, that's really cool, Paul. You know, it's not as hot here right now. They wouldn't recognize cool meant something like that. So that's what she's saying. This was a saying well recognized by the Jewish people, and the time. It's not recognized by us. So anyway, with that said, we'll move on to really the next
Wait,
question.
I got one question. Was there any commentator said anything about they were maybe fasting for their lives, or like they were praying?
No, that is could be. I thought about that, but the fact is, almost all of them lent themselves towards seasickness. They were unable to eat because it was so rough. They couldn't keep anything on their stomach, and there was no appetite to eat because it was so bad. Fear of dying, and it's 14 days and very little sleep. Food was the last thing on their mind. That's the way most of them, Charlie, leaned. It had nothing to do with fasting for spiritual enlightenment or any physical health.
And remembering that they had last week, they had offloaded most of their cargo, so there wasn't a lot of extra around, but they really probably were too ill. I can imagine.
Yeah, and again, you get into the fact that I really think this was a physical demand that Paul says you need to eat. But there are people, we talked about dropping the 4 anchors. You can get sermons on the 4 anchors. That's all spiritualizing around the 4 anchors and what the 4 anchors meant. And I don't think the 4 anchors had anything to do with anything spiritually that could have. A lot of times things are both physical and spiritual. We see that in a lot of scriptures. You can apply them both ways. Those anchors were absolutely needed in order to get the bow moved to where they needed them. And then they cut them and left them behind. So with that, the last question here is, why was there still wheat on board when they already said they threw out the ship's tackle and they threw out the cargo and the wheat? Why would you think there's still wheat on board if that was all offloaded because the storm was so bad they were afraid it was going to it was going to hurt the ship and actually sink it? So why do you think it was still there?
Mm-hmm.
2 reasons were given. One is they knew they needed food, and there was a minimum amount of wheat that was reserved for them to eat. The second is this is a sailboat freighter, call it, and it needed that for balancing. It needed to balance the boat with the proper weight, and so they kept the proper amount of wheat for balancing the boat that they needed down in the cargo holds themselves. So which one is true? Both of them are true. I don't know. But given what they said, there was wheat aboard, they ate, and then they got rid of it. Well, the last bit they got rid of was all of it, because what they're fixing to do is they're fixing to head to the beach. The boat's gone. Paul told them the boat's going to be destroyed. So they're not worried about anything else now, but to raise the sails, get as much speed as they can, and head to land.
So let's look at verses 39 through 41. When it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they observed a bay with a beach into which they planned to run the ship if possible. And they let go the anchors and let them in the sea, and meanwhile loosening the rudder ropes. And they hoisted the mainsail to the wind and made for shore. But striking a place where two seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable, but the stern was being broken up by the violence of the waves. So what is this kind of impact? What does this mean that they're not recognizing the land? And I don't expect anybody really to know this. That what happened is they actually crashed into Malta. So let me just go down to this map. Malta is off the coast of Sicily. So here, if you're coming into Rome, you might come around this way and get up into close to Rome, or you might come around this way. But here, Malta is this tiny little island off here. It is its own country now. It has its own independence now, but it's off of the route. So you would never actually, they would never fly. They would never sail that way. Typically, they would come from here and they'd go straight up this way. So it was really much further west than they were used to. So they're in Malta and they don't recognize it. And as Dave said, they came into this bay and they crashed there. Interestingly, where two waters meet, you have two different bodies of water coming together. And we actually have that situation here in Puerto Rico where the Atlantic and the Caribbean meet. And when two seas come together, there's this line of interference, this kind of rough waters, because for here, the Atlantic is much cooler than the Caribbean, and you have this activity when you're trying in that area, this turbulence. And so they never would have been to Malta. None of them were familiar with where they were. So they crashed into a bay that was later named St. Peter's Bay, St. Paul's Bay. But interesting, very interesting. If they had missed Malta, so if they had missed this little island, if they had not crashed there, they would have had at least another 200 miles, 2 to 3 weeks more of aimlessly wandering in the sea at the mercy of the wind before they crashed into Tunisia, this northern Africa. So really and you think of how tiny this little island is, it's almost like a needle in a haystack that God has them crash there. Now, yes, they probably would have been much happier to crash up here into Phoenix, but no, God's plan and his way was to have them go to Malta. And so I think that there's no way, if they hadn't hit this little kind of speck on the map, that they would have survived. Nobody would have survived making it to Tunisia. The ship would have been disintegrated. Nobody could have lasted that long, or they'd have nowhere to come ashore.
Yeah, and we went over this last week, and just to reiterate, you see the Syrtis Major and Syrtis Minor. Those are the northern coast of Africa. Those are noted for nothing but shipwrecks. In other words, they're really sandy, shallow spots and lots of rocks. And so ships really never make it through that area. And they were very afraid. Syrtis was brought up last week that that's where the northeast winds would drive them. And they knew they would lose their lives there. A ship doesn't survive when it gets into that, either the minor or the major Syrtis areas, because of the rock and the sand. It's so far out from the coastline. When you crash, there's nowhere, you can't even see the coast. So it's a really dangerous place. And so they kept north of that by God's providence to put them right where they needed to be. With that, we get into the last couple of verses here as we're winding down. We knew this would be a relatively short study tonight, and it's fine because it's Thanksgiving week. But the last couple of verses 42 and 44. And the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim away and escape. But the centurion wanted to save Paul, kept them from their purpose, and commanded them that those who could swim jump overboard first and get the land, and the rest, some on boards and some on parts of the ship. So it was that they all escaped safely to land. And we do find out all 276 people got off the ship, swam, got on boards, whatever, and made it to land, according to the historical notes around this. So very interesting. Not one was lost. Only the ship was lost, exactly as Paul had prophesied exactly as the angel of the Lord told him. Many thinks that was Jesus Christ's appearance to Paul. It really wasn't an angel. Again, I'm not going to get into that discussion itself. So the first question here is, why would the soldiers consider killing the prisoners at this point? Why wouldn't they be just jumping off the ship and getting to land themselves and want everybody for themselves? So why are the soldiers thinking about killing the prisoners now?
Well, in those days, if the prisoner got away, didn't they have to give their life, or their life was taken?
Well, if prisoners escape, the soldiers guarding those prisoners would be responsible to take the sentence that those people were sentenced to.
Okay.
We don't. So that's you're right, Charlie. That's the answer to the question. That we don't know who these prisoners are. We know Paul never got a fair trial. From Felix to Festus, with Agrippa, we went through all that story. He was retained in Caesarea for 2 years in kind of a house arrest. They couldn't find anything wrong with him. He knew he was going to Rome. He appealed to Caesar. This is his appeal to Caesar. That's why he's on the ship. He's going to Rome and it's appeal to Caesar. But we learn from that the soldiers themselves take responsibility for the prisoners if they allow them to escape. So that's the reason. But we don't know much about these prisoners other than Paul. And you remember, we think Julius was probably at some of the trials. Some of the commentators said they believe he was there. And so he knew there was nothing against Paul. Probably Festus as well, probably told Julius that, hey, look, we can find nothing wrong with this guy. He appealed to Caesar. You need to take him, but look, he hasn't done anything wrong. Remember, he released Paul to go to land and take liberty to go, what they said, refresh himself or be freshed up. Paul was sick. He went in for medical help, and Luke went with him as well as Arsaces. So those two people should have never been with Paul as a prisoner in the first place. So again, we don't know anything other than Paul, who didn't do anything wrong, who the other prisoners were. How many prisoners were there? We know there was 276 people on the Alexandrian ship. Nobody told us how many people were on the coastal ship. Those were the ones the prisoners were on. When they got to Myra and they went on the Alexandria ship, now we know there's 276. Some of those are passengers. Some of those are sailors taking the ship over. So we don't have an exact makeup here or know anything about them. But Charlie's right. The whole issue here is they said, if we kill all the prisoners, we're fine.
I think also they might have wanted the body too, if you think about it, because if they drown in the process of trying to get to shore, they can't prove that they
Didn't lose them,
didn't lose them.
Right. Good point. Didn't think about that. So the next question here is kind of an interesting question. If Paul is within God's will, why all this calamity? Why all this stuff going wrong? Why a nor'easter? Why these winds? Why a shipwreck? Remember, this is Paul's 4th shipwreck. He's familiar with being shipwrecked. He does not want to be shipwrecked again. He floated for over a day or more on a piece of board in a ship before. He said that in his other epistles. So we know he does not want to be shipwrecked again. So any answer to that question, why we know Paul is in God's will, why is he going through so much of this calamity or so much of this, call it tribulation, when he is in God's will?
Well, Paul was fine. I mean, he made it. To me, it's almost like if you're going to work for the Lord, you expect shipwreck all your life. I mean,
that's one way to put it, Charlie. We know Paul was sick. That's why he was released to the shore. There's no indication here Paul was ever afraid.
Right.
He had the messenger from the angel. Again, I really believe that was Jesus Christ came, just like he came and visited him at night, saying, "Paul, you've done good to Jerusalem. I'm sending you to Rome to be my witness."
Yeah.
So the fact is, I think Paul did not have the fear that these prisoners, I mean, that these other people would have had. So he was okay. But what you're saying is accurate. Many times when we are in God's will, we're going to face tribulations, persecution, and maybe even prosecution as well. The fact is, it's not uncommon for a Christian to be in God's will and also be in tribulations and calamity at the same time.
Right.
And this is a perfect example of how we should be. Go ahead, Charlie.
All right. I'm kind of, this is a stretch in my own opinion, but there are, what's the word? Evil forces in the world. And okay, now where was all the wind in the northeast that are coming from? Maybe it was stirred up by some spirits to keep Paul from going. I mean, that's the last place they probably wanted him.
I was
So I
thinking
mean,
about
it's just
spiritual warfare.
Yeah.
yeah, spiritual warfare. So it could
Yeah,
have been
and I
other
think
things going on that we don't know anything about, but whether it was going on or not, Paul had full confidence the Lord sent him here. Some kind of way I'm going to get there.
Yeah. And I think some commentators mentioned it was spiritual warfare. We know we're in spiritual warfare today. We know anytime we're in God's will, Satan's doing everything he can to bring us out of God's will. And so I think there's a lot of truth to that statement as well. So I think that's accurate as well. A couple of things here, though, as we go through this chapter. One, we didn't get into that because the length of it tonight. There are some commentators that take what Paul's done and points to true leadership. What is true leadership? Paul was a prisoner, a captive, and now he's captain directing the 276 people. He's come from the lowest of ranks to the highest of ranks. Paul was a leader of leaders. He has all the attributes of a leader. And one of the things that really a leader does, and I think John MacArthur, if you want to follow him on this, he goes into six or seven leadership qualities that Paul had demonstrated through this whole process. If you want to go look at that and you're interested in leadership qualities, I think that's a good sidebar study. But one of the things we look at here and we recognize is that we have courage by Paul. Paul has faith. He believes in God. He demonstrates that courage. And what happens is when you demonstrate courage, it becomes contagious. You can take the lowest of environments and have an enthusiastic, encouraging person that takes the whole crew and the whole group and turns them from being down to being up and ready. And that's what Paul did. It's an interesting sidebar here. I'm not much of a historian, although I've taken American history and all that. But one of the sidebars here is that George Washington, when 1776 and the independence was broke out, British troops were here. And the first part, the British were winning. They were winning terribly. We in many indications from what we get out of history, we were right on the cusp of being defeated by British, and we would not have gotten our independence. And so the story goes, George Washington, it's freezing. It's his whole soldiers they're cold, they're hungry, they're discouraged, they've lost war after war, event after event, and he brings them in the middle of the night across the river to Trenton. It's the garrison, the Hennison garrison, and they did the first major victory of the war against Britain. A day later, they crossed over and went to Princeton and defeated them. And these two events, when they were discouraged, cold, hungry, and just didn't know what to do. It was 2,400 soldiers. Washington took them over by ships in the middle of the night. The Britons weren't expecting, in the middle of freezing weather, a storm. They took them over. They defeated them. It shows you how courage of one man, George Washington, really got all these soldiers enthusiastic and got through all the hunger, all the discouragement, and went and where we are today. And so, really being encouraged is contagious. So stop and think about that. And the last tidbit here, as we bring this up, we look at life's applications, is you're recognizing always when you're in a situation, we talk about if you're in the will of God, you think you're doing God's will, you're gonna have things go wrong. Satan's doing everything they can. And if you remember back, we said the most dangerous time for a new believer is when they first come to Christ, because Satan sees a door there. I can get in, I can deceive them. Right now, I have an opportunity. Well, the fact is that when we have this going on, the first thing to recognize is the presence of God. God's always with you, even if you don't see him, if you don't feel him. Even in the darkest times, he's not going to abandon you. He promised that. Paul knew that. Paul knew that God was with him. So that's important to realize. And realize, too, don't be afraid to rely on other people of God to give you support. Lean on those people you know who are in God's presence, who is in God's will. They can give you the encouragement. They can give you the shoulder to lean on. And that's important as well, to lean on them. Also, rest on God's promises. And knowing what God said he would do, he will do. Paul had that. He believed God. He didn't say, I believe in God. A lot of people believe in God. Big difference in believing God. That's acknowledging God and accepting God as your Lord and Savior. Or believing God, saying, yeah, the universe had to be created something. Look at nature. God is everywhere. So very different. Paul believed God. He had all the faith. That's what faith is. Faith is the belief in God that it will come true. So that's another important section. And the last thing is remember the purpose of God. Keep your eyes on the destination that he's pointing you to and your ultimate goal. Don't get sidetracked, as you mentioned, Charlie, by spiritual warfares, because they will try to sidetrack you. They will try to give you the negative things that deflate you and move you off of where God's trying to take them. And Annette and I have experienced this many times. It's easy to get sidetracked by saying, well, why is this doing? Why is that happening? And the fact is, those sidetracks are probably engineered by Satan or by his demons for that very purpose, to get us off the tracks of God. So with that, we're down to the end of the chapter 27. We'll pick up chapter 28 next week.
Okay, let's close. Our dear Heavenly Father, thank you. Thank you for this scripture, this excitement that you put Paul through, but you were faithful and you brought 276 people safely to shore, people who did not know how to swim. They had to be terrified. That people that don't swim, I'm sure, just petrified to be going in the water and clinging to a board and hoping that they will somehow make it to land. We just thank you for your greatness that you brought each one of them to shore. I thank you for the examples, and I just pray that you would help us to know that when we're facing trials in our life, we need to have our anchor behind us and our bow pointed at you. I just pray that we would know that we would be focused on you and making it to your shore and your safety. Just be with us through our trials. Please remember our prayer requests that we have lifted to you, and we hand them to you, and we have all faith for you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Okay, we're done. I'm gonna give you a little trivia, funny question. Lighten up the night instead of all this deep stuff we're in.
All of the deep stuff. See?
What in the very last verse 44, what is the indication the first time something happened that's very popular today? What was invented in the 44th verse of chapter 27 that is really popular today in Hawaii and California and even Puerto Rico.
Great to you. And the rest, some on boards and some on parts of the ship, and so it was, they all escaped safely to land.
They were surfboarding. They came in on the board, surfing. There you go, Angie.
Angie got it.
So surfing was the first thing noticed for there. Oh, there's your light piece for tonight. Look, happy Thanksgiving. Don't forget to thank God and thank everybody for everything that he has given us. Just enjoy the rest of the week and have a great Thanksgiving with friends and family and whatever you have plans. With that, we'll say good night and see you next week.
Happy Thanksgiving.